Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Promising Teaching Practices for Men of Color, Insights for the Faculty Professional Development. And now, in previous webinars, we've talked a lot about concepts from our data, but today we will do something different. Today, we will hone in and really talk more in depth about the why behind our data. And so a quick overview of the webinar today is we want to provide an overview of the development and use of the Community College Instructional Development Inventory, or CCIDI. Secondly, we also want to identify key areas in need of professional development for college faculty. And then lastly, we want to explore some unique training and developmental education. And so here at our laboratory, the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, or CEAL for short, is a national research and practice lab that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for students who have been historically underserved in education, particularly students of color. And under CEAL houses the Minority Male Community College Collaborative, M2C3, which you all have probably known. And then CEAL was developed to advance 3 objectives, which is research, training, and assessment. And this is the team that works at CEAL. And we comprise of individuals from undergraduate students to masters to doctoral students, as well as faculty members here at San Diego State, and who comes from various diverse backgrounds, experiences working in the community college setting as well. And as you can tell, we are a very diverse group of individuals who reflect the student population that we are doing research on as well. And for today's webinar, you can go ahead and engage with us on social media, as if you have Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, our handle is @CEALLab, CCEALAB, and please use the hashtag CEAL or hashtag M2C3. And this is going to be our primary means of communication. So throughout the webinar, if you have any questions that you have as we're presenting certain slides, please go ahead and use Twitter as our main means of asking questions, and we will have some of our staff members monitoring those questions, and we'll be providing responses to that throughout the webinar. And then the main 3 instruments that we have here through CEAL is part of our institutional assessment package, or IAP. And what that consists of is, the first one is the Community College Success Measure, which is our student survey. And it's used to identify factors influencing the success of underserved students. And this is a Scantron in-class assessment where all students will complete. And at the end, there will be a report generated. Pretty much it's a triage report that will help your campus identify key areas for professional development in terms of advancing success outcomes for men of color and underserved students. The second one is the Community College Student Success Inventory, which is our staff self-assessment. And it's pretty much for determining an institution's readiness to facilitate successful outcomes for underserved students. And this one is an online self-assessment where it's usually meant for a small group of individuals, maybe part of an equity committee, that would complete this assessment. And this is really just to guide future conversations and programming efforts on your campus regarding supporting underserved students. Our third survey as part of the package is the Community College Instructional Development Inventory, or CCIDI. This is our faculty survey. And this is to inform professional development programming for instructional faculty. And this one is also an online-based survey. There will be a report tied to it that will highlight key areas that are in need of professional development for instructional faculty. Also in a triage report form.
Now what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the data that we're seeing with our student survey, the Community College Success Measure. And just really to kind of highlight some key areas that we see as emergent problems and recurrent problems. Really the purpose of doing this is to help set up what will be presented to you that really is some new data that we have that's specific to what faculty are telling us as well. So let's start out with some of our student data. This data that I'm going to present to you first deals with the concept that we have that's called welcoming engagement. We know that oftentimes when we talk about whether or not students are engaged, there's an assumption that all students have equal access to opportunities to be able to do so. And the research that we're doing really doesn't make that assumption. So instead of asking whether students ask questions in class, respond to questions in class, or participate in group discussions, we instead say, hey, do they feel welcome to actually do those things? So we don't make the assumption that they do. And we look at welcomeness to engage both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And what you'll see on this slide is that outside of the classroom, when we look at those students who say that they don't have those opportunities to do so, that there's a higher percentage of Black men in comparison to white men, and who basically report that they don't feel welcome to say hello to their faculty members when they see them on campus, or talk with them about academic matters outside of the classroom. And as you can see, this is not just a problem that's specific to African-American men, but also there are some challenges that we see that are facing our Latino male population and our multi-ethnic men, and on some of our measures, Asian-American men as well. This next slide focuses on the concept of racial and gender preference, which gets at essentially the more subtle notions of stereotypes that exist in the environment. And what we ask our students is, in comparison to men from other racial, ethnic, and gender groups, how do they believe their faculty members perceive them? Do they appreciate them? Are they interested in them? Do they want to work with them? And a much higher percentage of our men of color, and particularly you can see here in the data comparing Black men against white men, a much higher percentage of the Black men, for example, say that they perceive that faculty do not appreciate them and that faculty members are not interested in them. And again, and when we start to highlight, okay, well, yes, those are kind of the two biggest disparity groups, but when we start looking deeper, we can see that here for Asian men and for our multi-ethnic men, there are some additional challenges. But sometimes it goes beyond just looking at differences within groups and between groups. Sometimes we just have to ask ourselves, at what point is everyone having an experience that might be concerning and might be indicative of a climate and culture that is not conducive to student success? So here on this slide, you'll see the data that we have from our engagement measures, right? And so what we do is we look at engagement in 4 different areas, whether faculty members engage with students in academic matters inside of class, outside of class, and then non-academic matters outside of class, and then talk with them about course grades. So the 2 in the middle deal with outside of class interactions with students. The one with academic matters outside of class, and the non-academic matters outside of class. And what we have found with our work is that when there's around 30% or more students who are saying that there's a challenge in being able to do these kind of things, that's actually indicative in these specific areas of campuses that are not engaging in practices that are supportive of student success. So in other words, whenever we have a line that rises above 30% across these categories, based upon the work that we've done in validating these instruments over a 3-year time frame and partnering with over 100 community colleges to do this work, what we found is that when it rises above that percentage, it's a red flag. It's a signal that something is not taking place. And as you can see here, when we look at these areas that are rising above that percentage, there's a high concentration across the board of students, regardless of actually racial, ethnic affiliation for our men here, who do not have interactions with faculty members outside of class. That's academic matters and being able to talk with them about those things, or non-academic matters. And here's why that's important. Out-of-class interactions are one of the most important things that can facilitate success for men of color, because that is where relationships are formed. out-of-class interactions are where those kind of informal conversations can take place that really serve as a foundational precondition to effective teaching and learning practice inside the classroom. And what we've seen is this: when you look at federal data for the beginning post-secondary students longitudinal study, we see that for, in particular, Black men, those who said that they never had these interactions outside of class with faculty, only 22% of them will ever earn a certificate, degree, or transfer in a 6-year time frame. However, when we look at those who have those experiences often or frequently, 64% will earn a certificate or degree or transfer in that time frame. So we have to recognize that these out-of-class interactions cannot be ignored, because it is a strong factor that influences student success for men of color and as well for all students.
So after looking at results of the student data, the SEAL team and the community college partners thought it was important to follow up this research on teaching and learning practices of faculty in the community college. Thus, we created the CCIDI, which is an institutional assessment tool designed to inform professional development programming for instructional faculty. This allowed us to create, thus we created a national survey of faculty in the community colleges. It was broken down into to measure 14 teaching and learning practices that are shown to have an intensified effect on the success of men of color, based on epistemology, relational, and teaching. The CCIDI was initially distributed to 1,775 faculty members from 125 randomly selected community colleges, and threshold scores were derived from composite scale scores from participants from colleges that were in the top quarter of college success rates nationally. So based on literature on the men of color in the community college, we identified several recurrent themes on teaching and learning practices that lead to faculty-student engagement with faculty and men of color. We broke this down into 3 broad categories: relational strategies with students, epistemology, which is how faculty view students, and teaching strategies. The confluence of these factors lead to faculty-student engagement and are related to several success outcomes, such as persistence, achievement, attainment, and transfer. We further broke these themes down into, based on relational strategies, disclosing. So do faculty disclose information about themselves to their students? Do they welcome engagement inside and outside the classroom? Are they knowledgeable about microaggressions? Do they develop relationships with their students outside the classroom? Do they validate students about the work that they're doing and make them feel validated to be able to do the work? Epistemology, institutional responsibility, we look to faculty believe that the responsibility of their work is mostly held on the student or on the faculty. Thus, are they equity minded? Do they have high expectations of their students? Based on teaching strategies, we looked at empowerment. Do faculty empower their students to believe that they can do the work? Do they use collaborative learning inside and outside the classroom, such as assignments? Do they use culturally relevant teaching? Giving students opportunities to learn about the historical and contemporary contributions of people of color. Do they use intrusive practices when they notice students are not showing up to class or are falling behind? And do they do performance monitoring, making sure how well the students are doing in the classroom? Thus, we've created threshold scores and a color coding scheme based on national benchmarks, looking at the top quartile of colleges in the nation. We compared all other colleges in the nation to determine in what areas do they need attention. So areas that are red, such as are areas that are significant and show that they're not doing as well as the top quarter of community colleges. Orange means that there's a lower score than the mean of top quarter colleges, and they need attention, but not as high as red. And yellow means that there's that they scored higher than the mean of the top quarter of colleges, and it's an emerging concern. And green means that they scored significantly higher than the mean quarter of colleges, but they have an acceptable score. So this allowed us to create a structure that to create an aggregate percentage of respondents so that we could tell that they definitely need training, that they need training, and where do we prioritize. This also allows us to consider, okay, where do we create targeted professional development? So as you'll see in this next slide, we looked at all faculty, but we further break this down into full-time and part-time faculty. But first, looking at all faculty and comparing this to the top quarter of community colleges, we noticed that faculty need attention for training in nearly all categories, such as collaborative learning, performance monitoring, relationship building, high expectations, validating messages, etc. But where they need immediate attention is institutional responsibility. If we break this down by full-time faculty, we notice they are doing slightly better. They are doing better in faculty-student engagement, welcomeness inside and outside the classroom, but they still need immediate attention in institutional responsibility and culturally relevant teaching. However, as we look even more closely, part-time faculty have many more areas that need immediate attention, such as relationship building, institutional responsibility, high expectations, and welcomeness inside and outside the classroom. However, as we looked at all three areas, the recurring themes that show up the most are institutional responsibility. So do faculty believe that students or faculty are responsible for student success? Are they equity minded? Do they have high expectations of their students? Meaning that they want them to do high quality work and that they can do it? And are they conducting performance monitoring throughout the semester and making sure that they are doing well? Thus, when we could further break down full-time faculty even further. So looking at full-time faculty, we know their immediate attention is needed at culturally relevant teaching and institutional responsibility. However, when we look at full-time faculty in developmental education, they only need immediate attention at institutional responsibility, but are doing well and have acceptable measures at several teaching and learning strategies. When we look at full-time faculty with general education, they need immediate attention in performance monitoring, institutional responsibility, high expectation, validating messages, and intrusive practices. And when we look at full-time faculty who are teaching based on a major, they need immediate attention for culturally relevant teaching, institutional responsibility, and microaggressions. When we look at this for full-time faculty who work in multiple areas, they need attention in performance monitoring, institutional responsibility, and high expectations. So looking at the picture as a whole, we can see nearly all full-time faculty need attention for institutional responsibility. So the 4 areas that we recommend to focus for all full-time faculty is that they all have training for institutional responsibility, high expectations, performance monitoring, and culturally relevant teaching. Now, if we look at part-time faculty, we see a different picture. We see that for all part-time faculty, immediate attention is needed for relationship building, institutional responsibility, high expectations, welcomeness inside, welcoming engagement in the classroom and outside the classroom. For part-time faculty in developmental education, immediate attention is needed for institutional responsibility and high expectations. However, part-time faculty in general education need immediate attention in nearly all areas. They're doing well with culturally relevant teaching and microaggressions. However, this is why targeted professional development is needed for this particular area. And for part-time faculty who work in a major that's required for students, they need attention in nearly all areas. But with specific attention needed to institutional responsibility, high expectations, welcomeness inside and outside the classroom, and intrusive practices. And for part-time faculty with multiple areas, immediate attention to collaborative learning, performance monitoring, relationship building, institutional responsibility, and high expectations. And here's the whole picture. Thus, we recommend for part-time faculty, specific attention is needed for institutional responsibility, high expectations, relationship building, and welcoming engagement inside and outside the classroom. So when we look at this by time status, and when we mentioned about targeted training, for all faculty, we recommend institutional responsibility, high expectations, performance monitoring. With full-time faculty, the difference being that the additional requirement of culturally relevant teaching, and for part-time faculty, relationship building and welcomeness engagement inside and outside the classroom.
So based upon the data that you're seeing, we know that there are different training and development needs. And so what we've been trying to show with this data and really trying to emphasize in this webinar is that the one-size-fits-all approach to professional development is outdated and really ineffective. We have to know who we're talking about and recognize that there are different groups who are going to have different needs. Now, we didn't break this data down by you know, the discipline that they're primarily teaching in, but that would be another way to think about, are there disciplinary specific needs? Are there differences for those who are doing face-to-face versus online courses? So there's a lot of different things that we have to start focusing on if we're going to really engage in targeted professional development, because we know that that's what's needed to really advance outcomes for our men of color. So now, one of the things you'll notice here is that the top three things that really came out across the board, as Nexi mentioned, are institutional responsibility, essentially, you know, perceiving that you have a role as an educator and that there's a responsibility to support student success, holding high expectations for their performance, and then engaging in, you know, performance monitoring and relationship building. Now, if you look at that, that actually relates directly to some key concepts that we've repeatedly emphasized over the past several years as part of the work that we're doing. So, for example, we've talked a lot about these frameworks, these equity frameworks, right? Getting at this notion of institutional responsibility. You've seen several times us show this slide that says, you know, when we see data that show that there are disparate outcomes for our men of color, some educators see that and they say, what the heck is wrong with these guys? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? And that's a deficit way of perceiving a responsibility towards students and really externalizing that responsibility. And what we've advocated, as informed by the work of Dr. Estela Ben Simon, is to really start to say, what are we doing or not doing as a college or department that results in our men of color not doing as well as they should? And what we're seeing is that this concept, this notion of embracing that kind of way of approaching your work has a direct relationship to student success. So it's important for us to start thinking about this as not just a way of thinking about students, but a way of really moving our institutions towards better supporting success for our men of color. Another concept that you've seen us regularly talk about is this notion of the 4 elements of success. And we talked about, hey, you know, for a student to be successful, they have to be challenged and they have to receive support. But when we're talking about our men of color, we have to recognize that there's 2 preconditions that oftentimes aren't in place for them that may be there for other students. For example, you can challenge a student all you want, but if you don't have high expectations and believe that they can actually rise to that challenge that you're giving to them, they'll never rise to that challenge. They'll never succeed in the classroom. In addition, you can provide support to students, but if they don't think that you care for them, they're not going to use that support. And this, again, it gets to these notions of these concepts that we've talked about, but now we're able to show in even more different ways beyond the student survey data that we've had, beyond the interviews and focus groups data that we have, that these are important concepts. And then the last one, this notion of relationship building. We've said for many times that looking at the pyramid of success, that relationships are a foundational precondition to effective teaching and learning for men of color. And we go so far as to say, for educators, for those who are instructors who are in the classroom, it doesn't matter how good you teach. It doesn't matter how well you put together your syllabus. It doesn't matter how carefully you've constructed your course. If you don't have a relationship with these men, you won't be as successful as you could be. And now there's even more data to support this assertion that personal relationships matter because they're a foundational precondition to effective teaching and learning, counseling, advising, and any support practice for our men of color. Now, given that many of our men of color are concentrated in developmental education, what we thought we would do is go a little bit deeper than what we just did. So we just talked about several recurrent concepts that are important when we're talking about all of our faculty. But what we thought it was also important to do is look at what kind of development needs are needed for faculty members who are teaching in developmental education. And it's called different things in different places: developmental education, remedial education, basic skills. It depends upon the state that you're in. But looking at it, what are some of those patterns? So let's start with kind of the 1,000-foot view. We know that in the community college, in terms of faculty across all areas, not just developmental education, but across all areas, 76% of faculty are part-timers and 24% are full-timers. This is national data. Now, what we did is we took our sample from the Community College Instructional Development Inventory, and we said, let's look deeper at what does this distribution look like, because maybe that has some implications for faculty professional development. So let's start out with the full-timers. So 58% of full-timers are full-time tenured faculty. 17% are tenured track and 25% are non-tenured track, and those are primarily faculty who are at non-union institutions. Then let's look at the 76% who are part-timers, right? Again, the lion's share of many of college faculty. And we see that part-timers who teach at one institution only in just a couple classes, they represent about half of the part-timers. Then we see about the part-timers who have a full-time load, that's about 16%, and then about 34% of part-timers who are teaching at multiple institutions or multiple colleges, sometimes affectionately called freeway flyers because they spend so much time on the freeway. Now, let's look a little bit deeper now at the distribution of these faculty, these part-time faculty. So this is data that's specific to not to part-timers, but to all faculty across different areas. So we know that when we're looking at all of our full-time and all of our part-time faculty, 12% are primarily teaching developmental education, 28% are primarily teaching general education, 49% are primarily teaching major required courses, and 12% are teaching in so many different areas that they really couldn't classify it. So what we're going to do is look at that blue where it's developmental education. We're going to do a deep dive into this to figure out what does that look like in terms of the distribution of faculty members in each of these key areas. So of those that are teaching developmental education, of which we know a high percentage of our underserved students are concentrated into these areas, we see that of that 12%, 88% are part-timers. Of that 12%, 88% are part-timers, and then the remaining percentage of those are 12% are full-timers. So of that 12% are full-timers and 88% are part-timers. Now, this is a pattern that we've seen in our work pretty regularly. We've actually been to community colleges where there's not a single full-time faculty teaching in developmental education. And we've been to many colleges where there's only a handful that are. Now, we're not going to get into any value judgments about that, but what we would like to do is show you some data about how that might be producing disparate student outcomes. So let's take a look here. So among those who are faculty members in developmental education, again, 12% of those are full-timers, and you can see that 54% of those are tenured faculty, 25% are tenure track and 21% are non-tenure track. Now, I show that for information purposes, but look at this next piece here. We see that approximately 27% of those who are part-timers, who again teach the lion's share of these courses, are again teaching at multiple institutions. That's a sizable percentage that we'll want you to keep paying attention to as we delve even deeper into this. And then about 15% of them are part-time full-timers, again, part-timers who are contingent faculty who have full-time load, and then part-timers who are just teaching a couple of classes. So now what we're going to do is look at the right side of your screen into that 27, 15, and 58% and focus on that, because we're going to deep dive into here and say, and ask a question that's oftentimes not asked. Are there different needs for teaching and learning and development for faculty based upon these different types of designations? And what you will find is that the answer to this is resoundingly yes. So what we're going to do is show you some more of these impact tables. So this again was for this slide here shows overall for part-time faculty who are teaching in developmental education, the two biggest areas of concern in comparison to those from the top quarter producing institutions in the country is that there's a need for training and development that focuses on this institutional responsibility perspective, and a need for training and development that focuses on having, holding, and expressing high expectations for student performance. Now, let's take a look here at those part-timers who teach just a few classes at one institution. We can see that then beyond those two areas, there's three additional areas that open up that are in need of additional training and development. There's a need for more work on how to engage in collaborative learning in the classroom, in small group learning, and different ways of doing that. There's a need for a greater understanding of how to, of practices for welcoming engagement inside the class. And again, that's that concept that deals with, are we making students feel like they're welcome to engage, like we want them to engage, that we desire their engagement, that their engagement is valued, and an understanding of racial gender microaggressions, which we've done previous webinars talking about that topic. Now let's look at this next area. These are for faculty members who are teaching at one institution full-time faculty who are part-timers. So these are contingent faculty who have a full-time load. And we can see that there are fewer training and development needs for this group. And that's probably because they have more resources to be able to, and more time to be able to do some of these important strategies and practices. But there's still the need to engage in training with this group that deals with institutional responsibility and high expectations. Now, remember we showed you a slide that showed that 27% of faculty who are teaching developmental education are teaching at multiple colleges, or those freeway flyers. So now what we'd like to do is show you what that data looked like for those faculty members who are teaching in developmental education, who are teaching students who are in the need of most support. This is the data that we're seeing for this institution in comparison to our national benchmarks. When we deep dive into this, we can see that most areas are in need of immediate attention for training and development. This really speaks to the importance of, again, avoiding this one-size-fits-all approach to professional development and recognizing that there are greater needs for certain groups. When we look at this part-time faculty, this group of part-time faculty who are teaching at multiple institutions, some of the things that we see deal less with their commitment to students and more with the structures on our campuses that inhibit them from being able to engage with students in the way that they would like to. We know that many of these faculty do not have office hours. We know that many of them don't even have offices to have office hours in. We know that many of them have schedules that force them to spend more time on the freeway than they would be, than they could, and investing that time into students and students that they're working with. We know that if they do, let's say on a great campus, have offices, that many times those campuses are located in the bungalows. So what we want to say is this: some colleges, not all, but some colleges are structuring outcomes for students and creating systematic disparities by the types of faculty members that they're putting into certain classes. Again, when we look at these part-timers, we saw that there were certain areas that they were doing a great job in. right? In a certain areas that they were having success in, particularly with the data that Nexi presented earlier. But if we're talking about these part-time faculties who are teaching at multiple institutions, and they're teaching 27% of the classes in, and they account for 27% of the part-timers in developmental education, we have to really think about the implications of this data. Now, some of you might be saying, well, hey, we recognize that there's a need to do training and development in these areas. What are some resources that can help us do this? And so what we have here are two books that we've published, myself, Frank, and Khalid White on the first one. It's a guidebook focused on teaching men of color in the community college. And what it is it's a book that looks at best practices or promising practices that were elicited from faculty members who had a proven record of success in working with college men of color. And then our newest book, which really focuses more on classified staff, which focuses on how can we engage in some of these same kind of concepts, but outside the classroom, to create an environment of support that enables the learning, development, and success of our men of color. And lastly, we'd like to also remind you that we have, outside of SDSU, there's a center that we operate called the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement that does training in many of these areas that have been mentioned here. There's a program focused on teaching men of color in community colleges, and a program focused on supporting men of color in community colleges for staff. So one for faculty and one for staff. And as you can see in the bottom of the slide, it's been featured by a number of different media outlets, such as the Huffington Post, Diversity Issues in Higher Education, and Hechinger Report, to name a few. It's a one-week online professional development program. And I would say this, there are other ways that you can get these kind of targeted interventions and targeted training in these areas. So it's not solely that you need to be looking to Cora or even to our center to be able to do this, though of course we would like for you to, but recognize that there's definitely a need to ensure that there's greater training and development for our faculty, because the way that we engage in our current professional development structures is in some ways unconsciously and accidentally reifying some of the disparate outcomes that we see for our men of color. So think about how you can leverage faculty who have expertise on your own campuses, who might be experts in some of these different areas. Many campuses have faculty members in ethnic studies, Black studies, cultural studies, gender studies, sociology, cultural anthropology, who do training and development in some of these areas, particularly as it relates to racial microaggressions or culturally relevant teaching practices and using culturally relevant materials. There are faculty members in communication studies who have who do work that focuses on validating practices and high expectations. So what we're saying is that while we provide this, there are also resident experts on your campus that can also be leveraged to be able to provide the kind of training and development that's necessary for advancing success for our men of color. So with that, what we'd like for you to do is to engage in some of these discussion questions as it relates to some of the topics that we've presented. But before we do that, what we'd like to do before we turn you loose to be able to engage in this kind of discussion, we'd like to respond to any questions or comments that you may have about what we've said here. So again, what we will be doing is using the Twitter space and Twitter page to be able to respond to these questions. So if you have questions, again, it's the hashtag SEAL, that's CCEAL, or you can tag us at SEAL Lab. So we're going to start looking at those questions right now and use that as an opportunity to further engage in the kind of learning and development that's needed to support success for our men of color.